So we'll get started. My name is Allegra Picano. I'm a registered dietitian with Henry Ford Health. We are a health system located in Detroit, but we service individuals from all over the state of Michigan. And I have the wonderful job of talking about food right before lunch. So we're going to be talking a little about the Mediterranean diet and the Specific Carbohydrate Diet today in the management of IBD. So this is a disclaimer put out by the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, just reminding everyone that this is for educational purposes only, and that if you do want to start one of these diets, you should always discuss this with your gastroenterologist first. And here are the objectives. So before we got into the diets, I did want to talk a little bit about the relationship between nutrition and IBD. So as many of us probably already know, the exact cause of IBD isn't very well known. Researchers are still trying to pinpoint exactly what it is that causes the disease, although we do believe that there are 3 factors are involved. So the first one being an immune response. So it seems that within individuals with IBD, I think Dr. Musa Moons, if you were in the IBD 101 presentation earlier, she gave this really great picture of this overcrowded party, and I love that. In this individual's immune system is overcrowded and can result in some of those symptoms that we often find with IBD. There also seems to be a genetic component involved. So there seems to be, if you have family history of IBD, you are more likely to develop the disease yourself. There are also a number of genes involved within the process. There are also the third factor being environmental triggers. So there are certain factors within our environment that seem to initiate the genes that turn on this immune response. Some of those environmental triggers have been identified as certain medication use, stress, smoking, and this is kind of where nutrition comes in as well. It's thought that nutrition is a potential environmental trigger for the disease. And the exact mechanism for how food does that is still also very unknown, but we do believe that the gut microbiome is involved. The gut microbiome, as we probably know, is very complex, but we know it plays a very important role in our health. We know that it plays an important role not only in our gut health, but also in our mental health and our overall well-being. So if things aren't going well in the gut, that can definitely impact us all over. We do know that about 90% of our immune system is modulated through the gut, so that can play an indirect role with IBD. And food plays a direct role in the types of organisms that are found within the gut, the diversity, and the amounts of certain organisms. It may also cause inflammation in the gut, and it could alter the permeability. So we find that if the GI tract is more inflamed, those tight junctions, so typically our lining within the gut is held together very tightly. If we find that the permeability increases, there's now these holes within the gut that invites toxins and pathogens all within the bloodstream, which then can result in some of those symptoms. So we know that nutrition definitely plays a causal role in the disease, but it also plays an important role in the treatment as well. And there's been multiple dietary interventions proposed to be helpful in the treatment and management of the disease. However, the 2 we'll talk about today are the Mediterranean diet and the Specific Carbohydrate Diet. The Mediterranean diet is probably very well known. It's not necessarily a diet, it's more so an eating pattern that mimics the way that individuals in cultures along the Mediterranean eat. So when you think about cultures such as Greece, Lebanon, southern Italy, and parts of North Africa as well, they all eat in this very similar manner. It's a plant-forward diet, so it's focused on the intake of plant-based protein sources, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and I'll kind of go over that a little bit more on the next slide as well. It's associated with a lower incidence of chronic disease, so this is probably one of the most widely studied diets, and it's been found to be effective in preventing and treating things like certain cancers, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity and weight management. And it's also often touted as an anti-inflammatory diet. So kind of the thought process here is if it's rich in those omega-3s, those fruits and vegetables that have lots of great antioxidants and probiotics and prebiotics. So the thought is, if it does have all those wonderful, great anti-inflammatory properties, why wouldn't it be helpful in treating an inflammatory disease? And this is a wonderful visual. I think this comes from oldways.org, which is a website that's dedicated to Mediterranean diet and educating patients on the Mediterranean diet. And this is their pyramid. I'll often show this to my patients as just a really great visual to understand the diet a little bit better. And one thing I really love about it is that it's based on this foundation of being physically active and enjoying your meals with others. So we find that just sitting down at the dinner table every night with your family or your loved ones or your friends can make a huge difference in mental health outcomes and quality of life, and especially in a population where we are concerned with those things, that can be a really important thing to incorporate in their intake as well. The second layer and the biggest layer, as you'll see, are those fruits, vegetables, whole grains, your nuts, your seeds, your legumes, your whole grains, your plant-based or your oils like olive oil, all really rich in antioxidants, anti-inflammatory properties, which are all really great for our health. These foods are recommended to have daily and at every meal and should be a really big portion of the meal. So I always say, focus, make these the center of the meal, make those a star. A lot of times I think we're used to saying, I'll have chicken for dinner, I'll have fish for dinner, I'll have steak. Make those veggies or the whole grains, the nuts, the seeds, kind of the star of the meal. The next layer up is the fish and seafood. So the fish and seafood is recommended to have about 2 to 3 times per week, just because there's a lot of those great omega-3s, the fish oils coming from those foods, and those can be great to have in dinner throughout the week. The next layer up are those poultry, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. So you get lots of really great protein from these sources. Your calcium and vitamin D can come from the dairy products, and those foods are recommended to have daily to weekly, but typically in a little bit smaller amounts, just because anything coming from an animal does have a little bit of saturated fat. And the top layer there is meats and sweets. So another thing I really like about this diet is it's very realistic. It's not restrictive. We're all human, and sometimes we do need dessert. And so it's still saying we can have these things, but we can just have them in moderation. So they really recommend limiting those things to about once a week to once a month. And if you do have dessert, opting for more fruits. And then for beverages, they recommend water to keep you hydrated, and then wine in moderation. There are some antioxidants and a chemical called resveratrol in red wine, which has been known to have some great cardiovascular effects. So some pros and cons of the diet. Like we said, it's not a restrictive diet, which is really great when it comes from a nutrition standpoint. With IBD in particular, we're concerned with nutrient deficiencies. So the fact that we're not cutting out any grains or fats or carbs or anything like that, we're not really concerned with any nutrient deficiencies per se. Cost can also be a pro and a con of the diet, so kind of depending on the person. If you're someone who's eating a lot more of those animal proteins and you're switching to more of a plant-forward diet, your grocery bill might go down. A can of beans or some lentils is a lot cheaper than going for chicken or steak or seafood multiple nights per week. It also can be a con. So if, on the other hand, if you're someone who's eating more plant-based sources, but now you're incorporating things like salmon into your routine regularly, that can increase your grocery bill. Another pro of the diet are the flavor. It's very flavorful and it's enjoyable. Whenever I have found when I talk about this diet with my patients, they light up and they get really excited about it. And I think that's very important when we're talking about nutrition. Food and eating is something that we have to do every single day. So why not make it something enjoyable and something that we can look forward to? And that can improve quality of life overall. So I think that's a really big pro of the diet as well. It's also environmental friendly with going for more of those plant-based food sources. It does have some potential environmental effects as well. And like we said before, it's been associated with multiple health benefits. So not only for IBD, but also for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers as well. And there's very limited social impacts. So this is a pretty easy diet to follow if you were going out to a restaurant or you're going to a friend's house. You can usually find something that will be accommodating, usually almost everywhere. And it also may improve IBD symptoms. There's very limited research looking at the Mediterranean diet and IBD specifically, but the research that we do have does look pretty promising. Some cons of the diet, so like we said, it can be costly for some, and foods aren't always accessible. So unfortunately in Detroit we do have some areas, food deserts in the city, where local grocery stores might not be for another few miles away, and I have had a few patients who don't have proper transportation, and so they're relying on family members or their local 7-Eleven for their groceries, and these foods likely aren't going to be found at those places. And the diet can be time-consuming, so with it, you're eating a lot more whole foods, a lot more preparation goes into preparing those foods, and so if you're someone who's busy, you've got a family, or you're a full-time worker, or at school, sometimes that can be a little bit more difficult to maintain. Moving on to the specific carbohydrate diet. So this one isn't as well known, but it was first proposed in the 1920s by Dr. Sidney V. Haas as a potential treatment for celiac disease. Since then, it's been expanded and thought of as a potential treatment for a number of GI conditions, such as cystic fibrosis, IBS. It's even been thought for children with autism to help with that as well, and as well as IBD. So basically, the diet permits all food sources coming from monosaccharides, so things like glucose, fructose, which is the sugar found naturally in fruits, and galactose. And it excludes all foods containing disaccharides, so things like your sucrose, your table sugar, and lactose. With that being said, the theory is that as humans, we weren't evolved to digest these complex, long-chain sugars, and that when we do eat those, because they're not digested all the way, there's these long sugars that just aren't being digested, which causes the bacteria in the gut to have to feed off of them, producing more gas and more symptoms, which is something that could increase inflammation. So with that being said, it's a relatively strict diet, and we'll kind of go over that. You'll see that on the next slide as well. These are all the foods that are allowed and not allowed on the diet. So all fruits and most vegetables are allowed, as long as, fruits-wise, as long as they're not preserved in any sugar, syrup, juices. Most vegetables, as long as they're not the non-starchy vegetables, so things like potatoes, corn, peas, butternut squash, those aren't allowed, but everything else is safe. All unprocessed meats are okay. Doesn't include any lunch meats because those are processed and can have some of those fillers in there, which would be excluded on the diet. Nuts, nut butter, nut flour, all are safe. Eggs, most seeds, most dried beans. The only sources of dairy on this diet would include an aged cheese like Parmesan, just because the lactose content is very, very minimal in those cheeses, and then a homemade 24-hour fermented yogurt. And the only sources of sweetness on this diet would come from honey or those naturally coming from fruits. The foods that are not allowed, like we said, those complex vegetables, the potatoes, corn, all of your whole grains are also excluded, so that eliminates all breads, rice, oatmeal. Many of those foods are composed of those complex carbohydrates. All your other dairy products, so your soft cheeses, and your dairy, your milk, your yogurt, those are all excluded, as well as all those processed meats, your flax, chia, and hemp seeds, artificial sweeteners, preservatives, added sugar, and then other ingredients such as carrageenan, it's a derivative from seafood, and we often add these things to ice cream or plant-based milk products to give it a little bit more of a creamy consistency and texture. There's been a lot of research that shows that there's a negative association between carrageenan intake and some unpleasant GI symptoms. So some pros and cons of the diet. Similar to the Mediterranean diet, there isn't a ton of research on the specific carbohydrate diet. A lot of the research we do have utilizes very small portion sizes, or they're case studies, or they're anecdotal. But the research that we do have is very promising. They find that it may improve the gut microbiome and the symptoms of IBD. It seems to decrease inflammation within the gut, and in some studies it was found to reduce the need for medication. And in one pediatric study, it was found to assist with weight gain in patients. Some cons of the diet is it is a relatively restricted diet, so it can be a nutritionally complete diet, and it can be done well, but you do have to be someone who's very on top of nutrition, and you probably likely will need to be supplementing with certain supplements. We're worried if you're cutting out things like your whole grains and your lactose processed products. Those whole grains, especially here in the US, they're fortified with our B vitamins, and for many people, that's your source of folate. And so if we're cutting those out, we're putting ourselves at risk for folate deficiency, and that's already something we're at risk with inflammatory bowel disease. Same thing with lactose. That's one of our main sources of vitamin D and calcium. So if we're cutting those things out, we either need to be supplementing or finding other sources in the diet and really emphasizing those foods. Also, it might be time-consuming to prepare these meals because we're avoiding all processed foods. All foods are coming from whole food sources. We do need to prepare almost every single one of your meals, which can be very time-consuming for many people. Similar to the Mediterranean diet, some of these foods may not be always accessible to some people, so that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're living in areas where grocery stores aren't always accessible, or you don't have easy access to things like a farmer's market. You could get a lot of these foods that are included on the diet. It also can be a relatively expensive diet because we're avoiding processed foods. We're going with a lot more of the natural meats, the grass-fed beef. It can get really expensive. And it does have a significant social impact. So there aren't, unfortunately, a lot of restaurants that adhere to this diet. A lot of people aren't aware of the diet. So if you go to a friend's house, it's likely they're not going to be following these dietary guidelines. So it's really difficult for patients to go out and eat this way and still have a certain quality of life. So especially something to consider with, especially with IBD. It may, improve symptoms, but we may also be taking away, an ability to go over to a friend's house or go out to eat and enjoy lunch somewhere. So those are some things to consider with the diet as well. Looking into the research of the study, so like we said, the research is somewhat limited on both of these diets. However, one study, it's a relatively recent study. I believe it was just published last year. But the DINE-CD study was the Diet to Induce Remission in Crohn's Disease study, and it was basically a head-to-head study between these two diets. It included 194 randomly assigned adults with mild to moderate Crohn's disease. They were either assigned to follow a Mediterranean diet or a specific carbohydrate diet for 12 weeks. For the first 6 weeks, they had prepared meals ahead of time that were out of their control, and they were prepared by the researchers. And for the remaining 6 weeks, they were instructed to just follow their diet on their own. The primary outcome of the study was looking at symptomatic remission at 6 weeks, and secondary outcomes were looking at fecal calprotectin response and C-reactive protein response. This is some of the results of the study. This is at week 12, so I didn't include week 6 on here, but week 6 they didn't find any significant changes between the two groups. Same thing with week 12. They found within the Mediterranean diet group, 40.2% of participants were in symptomatic remission, and 42.4% of participants reached symptomatic remission. Fecal calprotectin response and CRP response also was no significant difference. So from these results, we could gather that the specific carbohydrate diet was not superior to the Mediterranean diet to achieve symptomatic remission, fecal calprotectin response, and CRP response. Some considerations with this study. So the study was only 12 weeks long, so we really don't know the long-term effects of whether these diets would be effective long-term, so that's something we still have to figure out. The study population also consisted of mostly white females. It was about 90% females, which we know that the Crohn's population is not special to just females. We know it affects people of all different ethnicities and genders and races, so it's hard to say if these results could be applicable to all populations. It was a relatively small sample size too, so larger than a lot of the studies we've seen, but still relatively small, so it's hard to apply these findings to the general population of those with inflammatory bowel disease. And it is important to consider that this was just in Crohn's patients, and it wasn't ulcerative colitis. We know that both these diseases do have different ways of manifesting, so it's important to understand that we might be able to apply these results to patients with ulcerative colitis. And these results may only be applicable to those with mild to moderate symptoms as well. Another thing I didn't add on here, this was kind of a last-minute thing I thought about, but with the specific carbohydrate diet, there is a special way that it should be started between patients. Typically, you start with a little bit of a fast where you're eating clear liquid diet for a few days, and then you slowly work into the diet. With this study, participants were just started on the diet. They didn't do the proper initiation of the diet. So there's been some argument that this might not be applicable. This may not really show us anything because these participants really didn't adhere to the diet as they were supposed to. But based off the diet, it still is a very exciting recommendation, and we can kind of see, comparing the two diets, how effective it was at treating the disease. But it found that both specific carbohydrate diet and the Mediterranean diet are potential nutrition interventions for those with mild to moderate Crohn's disease. But the specific carbohydrate diet was not superior to the Mediterranean diet in achieving symptomatic remission. So, given these results, the greater ease of following the Mediterranean diet and the other health benefits associated with the diet may be preferred over the specific carbohydrate diet for patients with CD with moderate to mild symptoms. And here are some resources for patients. The top link is the Old Ways website, which is what we talked about earlier. Really great website if you're looking to follow that diet. They've got lots of really great recipes and resources on how to follow the diet. With the specific carbohydrate diet, the top bullet point there is the Breaking the Cycle book written by Elaine Gottschall. She kind of expanded the diet and made it something that is kind of what it is today. That really goes in depth as to what the diet is, and it has some sample recipes in there and meal plans, so that's a really great resource as well. And there are my sources, and that's it. Thank you for having me.